were not with us on our last webinar call, my name is John Leatherman. I'm at Kansas State University and am facilitating the CAPE training program. I would invite those of you who are on the call to go ahead and activate your camera if you have one, so that we can look at one another. I'm hoping that this will be a discussion among us, and it's easier to have a discussion when you can see the other people that you're speaking with. So I do encourage you to go ahead and activate your camera. And I am certainly hopeful that you will feel free as I go through our discussion points to offer your thoughts and views about various kinds of issues. I guess the first question, this particular webinar is intended to be a discussion of the stigma of mental illness and substance abuse. And that is one of our principal training objectives with the CAPE program. And we've incorporated the mental health first aid program to partially address that. But I also wanted to build in a stronger direct linkage through our webinar training, because it really doesn't come through a great deal in the videos that we've produced. And so this is intended to really get at that question of mental health stigma. And indeed, I've heard it, well, I've read that stigma of mental health and substance abuse is one of the principal obstacles to people getting the help and assistance that they need and could benefit by. And so obviously that is a great challenge within our communities and with the people who are suffering from mental illness or substance abuse. And to the extent that we can do some things to reduce that would be very, very desirable in terms of making progress to deal more effectively with these issues. And once again, we began with the mental health first aid training program as a principal component of addressing this question of stigma. And as I understand it, everyone, all of the participants in this particular program were sort of expected to do the mental health first aid training on their own. And I was told that many or most had actually gone through the training. Has everyone on our call today actually been through the mental health first aid training program? I see pretty much everybody shaking their heads yes. The first question I have is, what were your impressions of the training program? What did you feel as though you were able to get from it? And how, if in any way, did it sort of affect you and your perspective and outlook in relation to mental illness issues and substance abuse within your community? And I would invite you to activate your audio and actually offer some of your thoughts and impressions.
I think for me, it was good because it allowed me to learn more about the correct language or person-first language that we ought to be using. And so for me, that was, I think, one of the biggest things I gained from it is sort of reorienting my perspective to focus on person-first language.
Okay.
I first took the course in 2015, and I thought it was so beneficial I became an instructor. So every time that I teach it, I get something different out of it, depending on the audience. But I think that there's a lot for saying that I feel more prepared should I ever need to use those skills.
Okay. Actually, I've heard a number of people sort of say that the training was a real eye-opener for them. For some of you, the rest of you, any other thoughts or impressions coming from the training program?
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay. These headphones are iffy. I liked learning actual definitions of various mental illnesses, because I think, you know, we throw the language around a lot just in our everyday vernacular. And so kind of checking ourselves on that and being mindful of, again, language like Kelly alluded to, was nice, just, you know, discussing and then having the discussion with the group in the room.
Okay. Actually, that was in preparation for this discussion. I suggested that you go to a handout that I prepared that's available on the CAPE website. And one of the things you'll find in that handout a variety of the resources that I was able to identify that address issues of stigma. And for me, in going through that, I came to recognize that I myself have been guilty of displaying all sorts of stigmatizing thoughts and behavior through the course of my life. And that was something that I came to realize about myself, and how quick I am and have been to sort of jump to an insensitive or a cruel thought about others that I may encounter. And it really has caused me to do a bit of soul searching about just how nice a person I really am, or perhaps am not. And so, yes, understanding the importance of language and to some extent, confronting the sort of thoughtful behaviors that we engage in just on a day-to-day basis was something that I came to understand and appreciate quite a little bit more. And I recognize that that kind of thinking and those kinds of inclinations aren't going to go away just all of their own. And they're not going to go away very quickly, because it's a lifetime of learned behavior, and it's going to probably require a lifetime of learning other behavior. And so, yes, the importance of language, I think, is fairly clear, and that is, in fact, part of what we would like to discuss here in this particular webinar. Now, referencing the handout material that I've recommended that you access, if you look on page 2 to begin, it talks about the different types of stigma that we may observe in relation to mental illness or substance abuse. And there are stigmas that occur at multiple levels. In relation to self, we may feel shame to admit that we ourselves have a problem. We may observe stigmas within our households, in our family groups, as we interact. We may observe stigma thoughts and behavior on behalf of people we encounter who need help, and we observe it in the community. And indeed, once you sort of begin paying attention to it, it's really quite rampant within most of our communities, within the media that we observe, and it really is widespread and fairly ubiquitous. Now, keeping in mind that there are stigmas that occur at all of these different levels, we've created a series of scenarios that I'd like to look at and briefly discuss, and would like to sort of go through these situations and perhaps think a little bit about what types of stigmas these individuals may be encountering and what might be done to perhaps alleviate some of the problems that they may encounter. In our first scenario, if you look at that handout, I'll just go ahead and read it if you don't happen to have that right in front of you. But in our first scenario, Barbara is a 36-year-old wife and mother of 3 living in a community of 50,000 population. She was a professional graphics designer. About 5 years ago, she suffered a serious auto accident, injuring her leg. She underwent multiple surgeries and was given pain medications. While her injuries seemed to heal, her family, co-workers, and people in the community began to notice changes in her behavior. She missed a lot of work, seeing new specialists. People began speculating that she sometimes appeared to be drunk at church and work. Others reported hearing many loud arguments in the household. Her children became unruly in school and were frequently absent. Eventually, she lost her job. More recently, she left town for over a month. She's back now and looking for work. So that's the first scenario that I've come up with. What do you think was going on in Barbara's life? Please, any thoughts?
It sounds like she had developed a addiction to pain pills from her accident.
That is what it perhaps would imply. It could be others would interpret her behavior perhaps as falling into an alcohol problem. And so I suppose the presumption could be that either of those might be the situation. Now that Barbara has returned, and perhaps the thought within the community for those who knew Barbara, she's returned and she's back looking for work. What kinds of stigmas do you think that Barbara might encounter given her circumstance and situation?
Well, I wanted to go back, if that's okay, to the previous question, what we think is wrong with Barbara, because my mind immediately also went to some type of substance misuse. But I wondered too, just because I have a sister who had a similar experience of getting injured in an accident, and I think also that just the trauma of the situation can really have effects on people, even causing like sleep deprivation, which can cause like crazy symptoms that seem like they're, they may be abusing substances as well. So just wanted to throw that out there of, being mindful too of folks' trauma.
Actually, that is a good point. And actually, I sort of created this to imply it was a substance abuse problem, but you're correct. Obviously, that was a very traumatic experience for her. And it may well be that she could be suffering some symptoms of a post-traumatic stress disorder or other kinds of issues. And so that is a very good point. If indeed it is suspected that Barbara has had a substance abuse problem, what do you think the challenges will be for her to obtain new employment? Do you think some potential employers might be leery of Barbara?
I think if she's in a town where other people might work there that also observed her behavior before she left town, then I think she kind of has to overcome that perception or portray a different, sort of portray that she's different than she was then. But I know when you talk about, 50,000 is not a small town, but I think the chances of, depending on where she's seeking employment, there could be people within that organization that observed what was happening after her accident, and so therefore she has to sort of overcome that things are different now. So I think there can be a lack of trust with somebody that seems I don't want to say unpredictable, but sort of, it appears in the scenario that she was sort of on this roller coaster ride. So, ups and downs. And so I think that plays into it, whether it should or not when she's seeking employment. But
okay. Actually, without betraying any confidence or anything, there was a circumstance some years back where there was an individual that I ultimately employed, and knew that this individual had experienced the substance abuse problem. And I'll tell you what, it took me quite a little bit of sort of getting over the fact of that circumstance and asking, can I trust this individual to represent my program, to go out and do extension type work and not create problems that would reflect poorly on me and my program. And so I did have to think about that quite a little bit before ultimately employing that individual. And I'll tell you what, it made a difference. And that person went on to become very successful so far as I can see in the years since he's gone on from my program. But it was something that I had some reservations about as a prospective employer. And I suspect that many people for whom it is known that they've had certain substance abuse challenges, I suspect that they too have some obstacles to overcome in terms of sort of regaining trust and reestablishing themselves in a more productive and gainful circumstance. That will take us to our second scenario that I'd like to sort of address, and that is James is now 28. He lives in a town of 28,000 people. He was always well known as a troublemaker in school and had frequent skirmishes with local law enforcement officials. Many knew him as a druggie. He dropped out of school and eventually was sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary for dealing drugs to support his own drug habit. He has since been released and is now back in the community. He says he wants to earn a GED, get a job, and go to college. What do you think the people in the community would think of James coming back and expressing those kinds of aspirations? Here again, do you think that people would trust that James was a different person?
I think probably people would be in either one of two camps. One maybe being that people would be proud of him maybe for trying to turn his life around and trying to have some aspirations as far as going to college and things like that. But then you also have the other end of the spectrum. I think that people would probably not trust him and feel like anyone that's been in prison probably could not go on to have a productive job and things like that.
A town of 28,000 is kind of a smaller community. And I would think that James would indeed be a well-known member of the community coming back from prison. And I think that the presumption oftentimes is that life in prison doesn't necessarily improve an individual, and indeed perhaps sort of the nature of the prison experience is one that can indeed be very harmful to the individual. And so I would indeed expect that people would be fairly suspicious of such an individual coming back and espousing the aspirations that he does. And I would think that an issue, there would be a considerable challenge in reestablishing trust of other community members in such a circumstance. Going to our final scenario, Kate is 19, has left home and is looking for a job. Lately, she is finding it very hard to sleep at night and then get out of bed in the morning. She has not had a job interview for a long time and has difficulty paying her bills. Her friends have noticed she doesn't want to come up with them anymore. She has been going to different doctors to get sleeping pills to help her sleep at night. Now she has a drawer full of different types of prescription drugs. She has been talking a lot about how hopeless things are and that things are never going to change for her. Do you believe there's something wrong with Kate?
Sounds to me like she doesn't have a lot of self-worth at the moment and hope, and is isolating herself from her friends and changing habits, maybe in part to deal with the lack of sleep, or maybe that's partially causing it. And maybe she's experiencing some depression as well.
It certainly does seem to me as though she is sliding into a depressive state of mind, and indeed is displaying several traits or behaviors that might suggest that she is indeed experiencing distress. Now, if you were one of Kate's friends, how would you respond to what you observed?
I would try to reach out to her. You know, she's sort of put herself in an isolation because of her feelings of hopelessness, and that are exacerbated by her financial troubles and joblessness. But maybe just sending her a message or having a phone conversation with her and just checking in, maybe not really trying to solve all her problems per se, but just being there to listen, because it might not be what we think either, but you know, just reaching out and saying, hey, I'm thinking about you, you know, I care about you, what can I do to help? Or, you know, do you want to talk about anything?
I think in this situation with Kate, you have to ask directly about suicidal intention or suicidal thought, just because it says she's been talking about how hopeless things are, and that's a red flag. She's got access to means and she has the pills, that's a red flag. So opening it up with, you know, I care about you, I've noticed these different behaviors and that makes me worried, and asking if she's thinking about suicide.
I myself tend to think that addressing directly her circumstance and getting her to open up a little bit about how she feels about her circumstance would be kind of a first step. And indeed, I guess, once again, reflecting on my own experiences, it takes a bit of very thoughtful listening to actually understand how a person feels about a given situation. I myself tend to be a person to jump to solutions, and not really I'm not a very empathetic listener, quite honestly. I tend to be a Mr. Fix-It kind of a guy. And when I understand that there's a problem, what I want to do is fix it just as quickly as possible. And I think that really in a circumstance like that, that is probably not what Kate needs. What Kate needs, I think, is first of all the opportunity to open up about her feeling state and her circumstance. And then it would take, I think, me as her friend to be able to listen very carefully to how she's feeling, to understand the depth of feelings that she's experiencing, and to recognize that it's potentially problematic. And if indeed I became convinced that Kate were potentially capable of self-harm or potentially contemplating suicide, then it is a matter of addressing it directly. And that is not a simple thing to do. And I, at one point, in speaking with another individual, came to realize sort of the depths of despair that individual was experiencing, and actually did have to ask those questions directly, and found it extremely difficult. And I actually, when the words came out of my mouth, I was unable to say, "Are you contemplating suicide?" It seemed like such a stark and harsh word to be using. And I actually said something more akin to, "Are you contemplating some sort of self-harm?" And that's about as close as I could come at the time. And that's, there again, kind of realized that it's not easy to ask those types of questions and engage in that type of interaction. But I also have come to understand that it may at times be very, very necessary. And I've also come to understand that it does not put ideas in people's heads. It's not going to make them more inclined to do anything to harm themselves, but indeed has the potential for exactly the opposite effect of having them come to recognize that they need some help. And but it is something that is challenging for people to sort of engage in that level of interpersonal interaction, and to actually address these very difficult kinds of questions of asking someone if they're contemplating suicide. And so it is something that indeed it perhaps is useful in perhaps a role-playing sort of a way to actually practice, because I think most of us would experience some level of discomfort asking another person a question of that nature. And so it is useful, I think. And indeed, I have just sort of finished up doing a training program where we did look at sort of issues of farm stress, and did discuss the high rates of suicide among the farm population. And indeed, as part of our training, we received training ourselves that addressed those questions, and we did some role playing where you ask somebody directly whether or not they're contemplating killing themselves. And it isn't an easy type of question to ask, but perhaps one that we need to be prepared upon occasion to ask another individual. And all of you, within extension and sort of the proximity in relation to farm populations may indeed come to encounter circumstances where among your clientele or others with whom you're engaged, that kind of a discussion may occasionally be needed. You will find among the resource materials that I prepared a host of resources having to do with discussion of reducing mental health stigmas. And these were some of the things that I had found in trying to do background research for the training program. And there are references to all of these resources at the end of the handout material that I prepared, and also some recommended reading, some fairly substantial resources about substance abuse, developing a stigma reduction initiative by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and an anti-stigma toolkit, a guide to reducing addiction-related stigmas. They are excellent resources, and I would encourage you going to the CAPE website. All of these items are available for you to peruse, and I think that you will find a lot of useful information there that can be beneficial to you as well. So I guess those were the items I had wanted to cover through the course of this webinar. I'd invite any of your thoughts or reactions to any of this thinking and this discussion. Has any of this been useful at all?
Yeah, a few of us are preparing a stigma reduction strategies presentation for our local FCS conference here in Ohio. So the resources have been helpful. One that were new to me, and I also wanted to point out that NAMI has a lot of great stigma reduction resources as well. And I believe it's they have like it's Mental Health Awareness Month, so there's a lot of social media ideas and campaigns on their website.
Good. Other thoughts or reactions? Actually, you will see when we get to that point in the video training, I actually prepared a drug abuse action plan to use as kind of a sample for your review. And I identified sort of 3 initiatives that I intended to undertake for myself in terms of what can I do to improve the situation with regard to mental health and substance abuse here in my community and in my state. And one of the action items that I came up with was developing a stigma reduction strategy. And so actually, I'm pleased that to hear that you actually have some similar type initiatives ongoing in Ohio. And ultimately, I believe that Rosa will now set up the links for the remaining videos and the remaining resources through the rest of our training program at the completion of this webinar. And so you will be able to access all of those items. And indeed, as well, you've already had the opportunity to kind of look at one of my action plans that deals with this notion of creating and sustaining a community coalition that was available for your review. And you will then again see my effort at creating a action plan dealing with substance abuse within the community, as well as sort of the culmination of what we're here to discuss. And so that will be available and open for you yet this week. And what we will do is give you a period of time to review those videos. And in approximately 2 weeks, I believe, we'll meet again by Zoom call to sort of discuss that whole section of training devoted to building community capacity, and answer any questions or consider any thoughts that you have on that component of the training program. And at the same time, we will discuss this notion of community action planning to address mental health and substance abuse issues within the community. And so that will be coming up in about 2 weeks. And in the meantime, we have a series of videos. I believe that there are 8 in total for your review. But once again, they're all relatively brief, and you can view those at your convenience. And so any other closing thoughts or thoughts or suggestions that any of you have before we sign off? If not, I appreciate your signing in today and hope that you found something beneficial through the course of our discussion. And should you have any questions or any concerns or other suggestions for me, you can feel free to contact me. My contact information is incorporated into each of the video segments, or if you have any other issues, you can reach me via Rosa as well. But otherwise, thank you once again, and I look forward to visiting with you again, and wish you well in the interim. Thank you.